Most mornings start the same way for a lot of people. The alarm goes off, and within seconds, the phone is already in hand. Before the mind has even settled, it is flooded with messages, notifications, headlines, and other people's opinions. By the time the day actually begins, the mind is already tired, reactive, and pulled in 10 directions. This is not weakness. It is simply what happens when the mind is handed over to noise before it has had any chance to prepare itself. The Stoics understood this problem long before phones existed. They knew that how a person begins the morning quietly decides how clear, calm, and focused the rest of the day will be. If this channel helps you think more clearly and live with more control, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps this channel grow, and it means more videos like this will reach you. Number 1. Waking with intention, not reaction. The first difference between a Stoic morning and an ordinary morning is simple. One begins with intention. The other begins with reaction. Most people wake up and immediately let the outside world set the terms of the day. A notification, a message, a piece of news. These become the first inputs the mind receives, and the mind spends the rest of the day responding to them instead of leading itself. The Stoics rejected this order of operations. They believed the first moments of the day belonged to the self, not to the world, and that this order mattered more than people realized. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections in the quiet hours, often before the demands of ruling an empire began. He used this time to remind himself of his purpose, his values, and the kind of man he intended to be that day. This was not a luxury reserved for emperors. It was a discipline available to anyone willing to protect a few minutes before the world made its claims. The lesson is not about waking up early for its own sake. It is about waking up before you allow anything external to define your state of mind. Intention does not require elaborate ritual. It could be as simple as sitting for a few minutes and asking what kind of day you want to build, not what the day will throw at you. This shifts the mind from a passive position to an active one. Instead of asking what might happen today, the Stoic asks what response he will bring to whatever happens. This single shift in framing changes the entire tone of the day before a single task has even begun. Reaction is exhausting because it is endless. There's always another message, another piece of news, another demand for attention. A mind trained to react first thing in the morning stays in that reactive mode for the rest of the day because it has never established a baseline of calm to return to. Intention, on the other hand, creates a center. Even when the day becomes chaotic, a person who began with intention has something stable to come back to, because that stability was built before the chaos arrived. This is why the Stoics treated the first moments of waking as sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a practical one. They understood that the mind is most impressionable right after sleep, before the noise of the day has hardened it into habit. Whatever enters first tends to set the tone for what follows. A mind that starts with reflection tends to stay reflective. A mind that starts with distraction tends to stay distracted. This is simply how attention works, and the Stoics respected that mechanism rather than ignoring it. Unshakable focus does not begin with willpower in the middle of a busy afternoon. It begins hours earlier in the quiet decision to meet the day on your own terms before anyone else has the chance to set them for you. This is the first and most overlooked principle of the Stoic morning. Intention before reaction, always without exception, because the exception is exactly where the discipline breaks down. Number 2, delaying the noise. Modern mornings are built around immediate stimulation. The phone is often the last thing touched before sleep and the first thing touched after waking. This habit feels harmless, even normal, but it has a real cost. It trains the mind to associate the start of the day with input rather than output, with consumption rather than preparation. The Stoics would have seen this pattern clearly, because their entire philosophy was built around protecting the mind from unnecessary noise, especially noise that could not be controlled or acted upon in that moment. Epictetus taught that the essential Stoic skill is distinguishing between what is within our control and what is not. Notifications, headlines, and other people's updates are almost entirely outside our control. Yet checking them first thing in the morning gives them priority over the things that are within our control, such as our attitude, our plans, and our focus. This is a quiet but significant reversal of priorities, repeated every single morning, often without the person even noticing it is happening. Delaying the noise is not about avoiding technology out of fear or moral superiority. It is about sequencing. The Stoic does not necessarily reject the modern world. He simply refuses to let it dictate the terms of his mind before his mind has had a chance to establish itself. A short period of delay, even 15 or 30 minutes, is often enough to change the entire quality of a day because it gives the mind time to settle into its own rhythm before absorbing anyone else's. There's a difference between information and noise. Information helps a person make better decisions. Noise simply demands attention without offering anything useful in return. Much of what fills a phone screen in the first minutes of the day is noise disguised as information, urgent seeming but rarely important. The Stoic morning routine is, in part, a filtering system. It creates space between waking and consuming, and in that space, judgment has room to operate instead of being bypassed entirely. This delay also protects something more subtle, the sense of ownership over one's own mind. When the first thoughts of the day come from outside sources, a person spends the morning thinking about other people's problems, other people's opinions, and other people's emergencies. When the first thoughts come from within, shaped by reflection and intention, a person begins the day thinking about his own values and priorities. Over time, this difference compounds into a completely different relationship with one's own attention. Unshakable focus is, at its core, the ability to choose what deserves your attention rather than letting whatever arrives first claim it by default. Delaying the noise each morning is a small, repeatable act of that choice. It is not extreme. It is not dramatic. It is simply a boundary quietly enforced day after day until it becomes the natural order of things rather than an effort. Number 3, the view from above. One of the most practical Stoic exercises for the morning is what Marcus Aurelius called viewing life from above. This means mentally stepping back from the immediate pressures of the day and seeing them in proportion to the larger scale of a life, a lifetime, or even history itself. It sounds abstract, but its purpose is entirely practical. Most anxiety and scattered focus come from treating small problems as if they were enormous. The view from above corrects that distortion before it has a chance to take hold. In practice, this exercise takes only a few minutes. A person sits quietly and considers the day ahead, the meetings, the tasks, the possible conflicts, and then deliberately zooms out. He considers how this day fits into the larger context of his goals, his values, and ultimately his mortality. This is not meant to be morbid. It is meant to restore proportion. A difficult conversation feels different when considered against the backdrop of an entire life, rather than in isolation as an isolated, looming event. This kind of perspective taking has a direct effect on focus. When problems are seen at their true size, the mind spends less energy on exaggerated worry and more energy on actual solutions. Much of what scatters attention throughout the day is not the difficulty of tasks themselves, but the emotional weight added to them by distorted perspective. The view from above strips away that excess weight before the day even begins, leaving only the practical work that actually needs to be done. Marcus Aurelius used this practice constantly, not because his responsibilities were small, but because they were enormous. Ruling an empire, managing constant threats, and facing personal loss required a mind that could hold serious matters without being overwhelmed by them. His private writings show a man consistently returning to scale and proportion as a way of maintaining clarity. This was not detachment from life. It was a method for engaging with life without being consumed by it. This exercise also builds resilience for the unexpected. A person who has practiced zooming out each morning is less likely to be derailed by a single bad meeting, a single criticism, or a single setback later in the day. He has already trained his mind to see these things in proportion. This does not mean he stops caring. It means his caring does not collapse into panic or paralysis the moment something goes wrong, because he has already rehearsed the larger context that contains that moment. Unshakable focus requires a mind that is not easily hijacked by disproportionate reactions. The view from above, practiced each morning, is one of the most direct ways to build that kind of mind. It does not eliminate difficulty. It simply ensures that difficulty is met with clear judgment rather than exaggerated fear, which is often the real difference between a day that feels chaotic and a day that feels manageable. Number 4, preparing for obstacles before they arrive. The Stoics practiced a technique known as Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Each morning, they would briefly consider what might go wrong that day. A difficult colleague, a delay, a piece of bad news, not to invite pessimism, but to remove the element of surprise. This is one of the most misunderstood Stoic practices, often mistaken for negative thinking, when in fact it is one of the most effective tools for maintaining steady focus under pressure. The logic behind this practice is straightforward. Most people are not undone by difficulty itself, but by the shock of difficulty they did not expect. A person who has never considered the possibility of a setback experiences that setback as a crisis. A person who has already mentally rehearsed the possibility experiences the same event as something familiar, something already accounted for. The event does not become easier, but the response to it becomes far more composed. This morning exercise is brief by design. It is not meant to spiral into anxious rumination about everything that could possibly go wrong. It is a short, deliberate acknowledgement. Today may include frustration, delay, or disappointment, and that is acceptable because it is a normal part of any life. This small act of acceptance, repeated each morning, gradually removes the emotional charge that unexpected obstacles usually carry, because they are no longer unexpected. Seneca wrote extensively about the danger of being caught off guard by fortune. He argued that the wise person treats good fortune as a loan that could be recalled at any time, and treats setbacks as expected variations rather than personal injustices. This mindset is not fatalistic. It is preparatory. A soldier who is trained for difficult terrain moves through it with more confidence than one who expected smooth ground the entire way. The Stoic Morning Routine trains the mind in exactly this way, terrain by terrain, day by day. This practice also protects focus in a very direct, practical sense. When an obstacle arrives and a person has not prepared for the possibility, a significant portion of his mental energy goes toward processing the shock of it before he can even begin addressing the problem itself. When the obstacle has already been anticipated, that energy is preserved. The mind moves directly into problem solving instead of first passing through disbelief, frustration, or a sense of unfairness that a genuinely prepared mind rarely needs to experience. Unshakable focus is not the absence of obstacles. It is the presence of a mind that has already made peace with the fact that obstacles will come. The Stoic Morning Routine builds this peace deliberately, a few minutes at a time, so that when difficulty does arrive later in the day, it meets a mind that is ready rather than a mind that is caught off guard and scrambling to recover its composure. Number 5, reviewing roles and duties. The final piece of the Stoic Morning Routine involves a quiet review of one's roles and responsibilities for the day. This is not a task list in the modern sense. It is a reflection on the different roles a person occupies as a professional, a family member, a friend, a citizen, and what each of those roles genuinely requires that day. This exercise brings clarity to focus because it grounds the day's tasks in something deeper than urgency. It grounds them in purpose. Epictetus taught that a well-lived life comes from understanding one's roles clearly and fulfilling them with integrity, rather than being pulled in every direction by whoever makes the loudest demand. A person who reviews his roles each morning is less likely to spend his energy on things that do not actually belong to those roles. He knows before the day begins what genuinely matters and what is simply noise wearing the costume of urgency. And this distinction alone eliminates a significant amount of wasted focus. This review also prevents a common modern problem: reactive prioritization. Without a clear sense of roles and duties, a person's day is often shaped entirely by whoever emails first or whichever task feels most urgent in the moment. This leads to a day that looks busy but produces little of lasting value. A brief morning review reverses this. It sets priorities according to what actually matters within a person's roles and values, rather than according to the arbitrary order in which demands happen to arrive. There is also a moral dimension to this practice that the Stoics considered essential. Fulfilling one's roles well, as a parent, a worker, a friend, was not seen as separate from personal virtue. It was considered one of the primary expressions of virtue in daily life. This means the morning review is not simply a productivity technique. It is a moment of aligning the practical day ahead with the kind of character a person is trying to build, which gives even ordinary tasks a sense of weight and purpose they would otherwise lack. This practice also creates internal accountability that does not depend on outside validation. A person who reviews his duties each morning has a private standard to measure his day against, independent of praise or criticism from others. This is a significant source of steady focus, because it means his sense of a day well spent does not fluctuate based on how others respond to him. It is anchored instead in whether he met his own responsibilities with integrity, a standard entirely within his control. Unshakable focus, in the end, is not simply about ignoring distraction. It is about knowing clearly what deserves attention in the first place. The Stoic Morning Routine, built from intention, delayed noise, proportion, preparation, and a clear review of duty, gives a person exactly that clarity before the day has even truly begun. This is why it remains as practical today as it was 2,000 years ago, requiring nothing more than a few quiet minutes and the discipline to protect them. None of what has been described here requires a radical change of lifestyle. It does not require waking up at 4 in the morning, owning a journal with a leather cover, or retreating to a mountain somewhere far from daily life. The Stoic morning routine is built from small, repeatable decisions. A few minutes of intention, a short delay before checking a phone, a moment of perspective, a brief acknowledgement of possible difficulty, and a quiet review of duty. None of these steps are impressive on their own. Their power comes from repetition, from being done quietly and consistently, day after day, until they stop feeling like effort and start feeling like identity. This is worth repeating because it is where most people go wrong when they try to adopt a new discipline. They look for something dramatic, something that feels significant enough to match the size of the problem they're trying to solve. But focus is not lost dramatically. It is lost gradually, one reactive morning at a time, one skipped moment of reflection at a time, until scattered attention simply becomes the default state of the mind. The solution, in the same way, is not dramatic. It is a quiet correction applied consistently until a scattered mind slowly becomes a steady one.